The biting wind whips dust around the makeshift lean-to, and Eleanor Hayes pulls her threadbare shawl tighter, a gesture that does little to ward off the chill or the gnawing uncertainty that is her constant companion. Before her, 6 grimy faces, illuminated by the flickering, greasy light of a single lantern, squint at the slate she holds. Her fingers, chapped and sore, trace the letter A. She is teaching them to read, these hard-bitten miners of Blackwood Creek, a small act of defiance against the ignorance that shadows their lives as much as the coal dust stains their skin. Her own shadow, however, is a more personal one, rounding her belly with the undeniable proof of a future she hadn't chosen but must now protect. This child, growing within her, is the reason she endures the cold, the hunger, the judgment that sometimes flickers in the eyes of strangers. For this child, she will brave anything. The men are slow, their hands more accustomed to the pickaxe than the chalk, but there's a hunger in their eyes too, a different kind, a yearning for something beyond the darkness of the tunnels and the fleeting solace of the saloon. There's more to Eleanor than meets the eye. Before her true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. Unseen, unheard, a figure stands at the edge of the camp, partially obscured by the skeletal frame of a long-abandoned wagon. Caleb Thornton, a man whose quiet wealth was carved from distant, richer lands, watches the scene in the lean-to. His presence in Blackwood Creek is a subject of some speculation. He has no obvious stake in this gritty, struggling outpost. Yet, for weeks, he has observed the pregnant woman with an intensity that is both searching and strangely resolute. He notes the weariness in the slope of her shoulders, the gentle patience in her voice as she coaxes sounds from rough throats, the stubborn lift of her chin that speaks of a spirit not yet broken. He sees not just a woman in need, but a beacon in a bleak landscape. And Caleb Thornton, a man accustomed to shaping his own destiny, feels a plan beginning to form, a subtle current pulling him towards this small circle of light, a plan that concerns Eleanor Hayes and the unborn child she carries, a future she cannot yet imagine. He'd come to Blackwood Creek on a rumor, a whisper of a scene that might mirror the one that had made his fortune. But it was this scene, this quiet determination against a backdrop of harshness, that truly held his attention now. And with a quiet nod to himself, a decision solidifying in the vast quiet of the high desert night, he knew his purpose here was shifting, evolving into something far more personal than prospecting. Her resilience was a rare vein of gold, more precious than any he might unearth from the stubborn rock. Eleanor Hayes had arrived in Blackwood Creek with little more than the clothes on her back and a desperate hope to outrun a past that nipped at her heels like a starving wolf. The father of her child, a smooth-talking peddler named Silas, had vanished with the dawn and her meager savings, leaving her stranded in a town that had offered promises as empty as his heart. The journey westward had been a blur of jolting wagons, scarce meals, and the crushing weight of shame. Blackwood Creek, a raw gash in the wilderness, wasn't a destination. It was merely where her last dollar had run out. The initial days were a haze of fear. A lone woman, visibly pregnant, was an easy target for assumptions and worse. She found shelter in a disused shed, offered by a grudging storekeeper in exchange for mending his clothes, the rough burlap walls a scant barrier against the elements and the unease that prickled her skin. It was Jed, a grizzled miner with eyes that had seen too much hardship, who had first approached her, not with leering intent, but with a curious respect. He'd seen her reading a tattered book of poetry, a relic from a life that felt a lifetime ago, her lips moving silently, a small frown of concentration on her face. You know them letters, miss?" he'd asked, his voice raspy. From that hesitant question, an idea had sparked. If she could teach them, even a few, perhaps they would offer her a measure of protection, a way to earn her keep beyond darning socks. The miners, initially skeptical, were won over by her quiet persistence and the dawning realization that literacy was a tool, a weapon against the foreman who cheated them on their tallies and the contracts they couldn't decipher. Caleb Thornton, by contrast, moved through the world with an assurance born of success and self-reliance. His ranch, nestled in a fertile valley many days' ride from Blackwood Creek, was a testament to his shrewdness and hard work. He was not a man given to whimsy. His wealth had been earned, not inherited, wrested from the earth through foresight and relentless effort. He was known for his fair dealings, his quiet philanthropy in the territorial capital, and an aloofness that some mistook for arrogance but was, in truth, a deeply ingrained reserve. He'd come to Blackwood Creek following whispers of a new silver strike, a chance to expand his interests. He'd expected to find rock and dust, greed and desperation, the usual components of a new mining camp. He hadn't expected to find Eleanor Hayes. The mining camp of Blackwood Creek was a microcosm of the frontier itself, raw, unforgiving, and teetering on the edge of chaos. It was a place where life was cheap and comforts few. The air hung thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale beer, and the ever-present grit. Yet, within this harsh environment, Eleanor's makeshift school had become a small sanctuary. The miners, rough-hewn men like Big Tim, a gentle giant whose massive hands fumbled with the chalk, and young Davy, barely a man, whose eyes lit with fierce pride when he first spelled his own name, formed a protective circle around her. They shared their meager rations, ensured she had the warmest spot by the fire, and their collective presence deterred the baser elements that drifted through the camp. The threat, however, was not always so overt. It was in the sneer of the camp overseer, a man named Grice, whose gaze lingered on Eleanor with a mixture of contempt and something uglier. "Wasting your time on these illiterates, sweetheart?" he drawled one afternoon, spitting tobacco juice near her worn boots. "A woman in your condition ought to be finding a more suitable arrangement." His words, sharp and demeaning, hung in the air, a stark reminder of her vulnerability. Caleb, observing from the doorway of the assayer's office across the muddy track, had felt a cold anger tighten his jaw. Grice was a bully, preying on the weak, and Eleanor, despite her inner strength, was undeniably in a precarious position. Her little school was set up in a corner of the communal mess tent, a space grudgingly conceded by the cook, a pragmatic man who saw the benefit in miners who could read his posted menus and inventories. The rough-hewn table, a plank laid over 2 barrels, served as her desk. The evenings were filled with the murmur of voices sounding out words, the scratch of chalk on slate, and the occasional burst of frustrated cursing quickly hushed by the others. These were the moments Caleb often observed, the flickering lantern light casting long shadows, Eleanor's face soft with concentration, her hand gently guiding a calloused finger. He saw the transformation in the men, a spark of dignity, a flicker of hope. He also saw the toll it took on her, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she sometimes pressed a hand to her aching back. He'd begun his subtle interventions cautiously, a sack of better quality flour and dried beans left anonymously near her shed, a bundle of firewood appearing as if by magic when the nights grew colder. He justified these actions to himself as simple charity, the kind he often dispensed. But he knew, in a recess of his honest heart, that this was different. There was a pull, an investment of emotion that went beyond mere altruism. He found himself thinking of her at odd hours, her quiet courage a counterpoint to the rough ambition that usually consumed his thoughts. He worried for her, for the child. The frontier was no place for a lone woman on the cusp of childbirth, especially one with no visible means of long-term support. His plan, still nebulous in its details, began to solidify around a single, undeniable point. She needed a protector, a provider. And he, Caleb Thornton, was in a position to be both. The question that gnawed at him was how to offer such a thing without alarming her, without appearing to be just another man seeking to take advantage of her plight. The awkwardness of her situation, and his own uncharacteristic hesitation were new and unsettling territories for him. He was a man of action, of direct proposals, but this required a finesse he wasn't sure he possessed. He'd watched her patiently explain the difference between there and there to a miner whose brow was furrowed in immense concentration, and the image stayed with him, a quiet testament to her unwavering dedication in the face of her own looming uncertainties. One particularly blustery evening, as sleet hammered against the canvas of the mess tent, Eleanor felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool and unwashed bodies, and the single lantern seemed to cast more shadows than light. She swayed, her hand flying to the rough plank table for support. Big Tim, his massive form hunched over a primer, looked up, his brow furrowed with concern. "You all right, Ms. Hayes?" Before she could answer, the world tilted, and the voices of her students receded into a muffled roar. She felt herself falling, a distant awareness of shouts, of hands reaching for her. When she opened her eyes, she was lying on a makeshift pallet of blankets in the corner, a damp cloth on her forehead. Jed was kneeling beside her, his weathered face etched with worry. "Easy now, miss. You just took a bit of a turn." "The baby?" she whispered, her hand instinctively going to her swollen abdomen, a surge of panic tightening her chest. "Seems all right, far as we can tell," Jed said gruffly, but his eyes were kind. "Just worn out, I reckon. You ain't been eatin' proper, have you?" She didn't answer, the shame of her poverty a familiar ache. Later that night, huddled in her shed, the wind whistling through the cracks, she found a carefully wrapped parcel just inside the door. Inside was a roasted chicken, still warm, a loaf of fresh bread, and a small jar of apple preserves. There was no note, no indication of who had left it. Tears pricked her eyes, not just from gratitude, but from a profound sense of loneliness. This anonymous kindness, while deeply welcome, only highlighted her isolation. Who was this silent benefactor, and why were they helping her? Caleb had seen her collapse. He'd been standing in the shadows near the mess tent, a habit he'd fallen into, listening to the drone of her lessons. The sight of her falling had sent a jolt of alarm through him, a protective instinct so fierce it surprised him. He'd almost stepped forward, but the miners had been quick to her side. He'd waited, his heart pounding, until he saw her stir. Then, under the cover of the worsening storm, he'd retrieved the provisions he'd purchased earlier from the camp's opportunistic sutler, at a typically inflated price, and left them at her door. He'd acted on impulse, a raw need to alleviate her immediate distress. But as he walked back to his own more comfortable, yet strangely empty, rented cabin at the edge of Blackwood Creek, he knew his detached observations were no longer sustainable. His plan needed to accelerate. Her fainting spell was a stark warning. Time was running out not just for her, but for him to act. He had to find a way to approach her, to make his offer before fate, in its often cruel way, intervened. He imagined her, alone in that cold shed, and the thought was a spur, urging him toward a course of action that was both bold and terrifyingly uncertain. He was a man used to calculating risks in business, weighing ledgers and projections. But this was a different kind of gamble, one where the currency was trust and the stakes were human hearts. He lay awake long into the night, the wind howling like a banshee, his mind racing, trying to devise the right words, the right approach, to offer help without causing offense or fear. His wealth, usually a tool of confident action, suddenly felt like a clumsy burden, a potential barrier to the very connection he hoped to forge. The anonymous gifts continued. A warm blanket appeared one morning, softer and thicker than anything she could have afforded. A small sack of coffee beans, a luxury she hadn't tasted in months. Once, even a bar of scented soap, its delicate fragrance a poignant reminder of a more refined past. Eleanor found herself caught between gratitude and a growing unease. She asked Jed and the other miners, but they all professed ignorance, their expressions a mixture of genuine surprise and a subtle, shared protectiveness. "Maybe an angel's watching over you, Miss Hayes," Big Tim had rumbled, a hopeful smile on his broad face. Eleanor wasn't sure about angels, but she knew someone was watching. She started to look over her shoulder more often, scanning the rough faces in the camp, searching for a clue, a sign. Her attempts to uncover her benefactor's identity were met with a frustrating silence. The camp, usually a hotbed of gossip and speculation, seemed to have formed a silent conspiracy to shield this unknown guardian. Caleb, for his part, found a strange satisfaction in these clandestine acts of care. It was a way to bridge the distance between them, to ease her burdens without yet having to face the complexity of a direct proposal. He learned more about her through careful, indirect inquiries. He spoke with the storekeeper, casually mentioning the teacher and her students, gleaning small details about her arrival, her quiet dignity. He'd even had a brief, seemingly accidental conversation with Jed, praising the miners' newfound literacy, and Jed, proud of their teacher, had spoken of her kindness, her past sorrows hinted at but never fully revealed. "She's a good woman, Mr. Thornton," Jed had said, his gaze direct. "Seen a hard road, but ain't let it break her spirit." This knowledge only deepened Caleb's resolve. His initial plan had been somewhat pragmatic. Offer her a position as a governess on his ranch, a respectable role that would provide for her and the child. But as he watched her, as he orchestrated these small comforts, his feelings began to shift. It was more than admiration for her resilience. A deeper, more personal current was pulling him. He began to imagine her not just as an employee, but as a presence in his life, a companion in his large, empty house. The thought was both appealing and daunting. He was a solitary man by nature, his heart guarded after a youthful disappointment. To open himself up again, to risk that kind of vulnerability, was a significant step. The first real test of his hidden involvement came when a new overseer, a man even more odious than Grice, arrived at the camp. This man, Silas Blackwood, no relation to the Creek's name, a cruel irony he seemed to relish, had a reputation for cruelty and corruption that preceded him. On his second day, he swaggered into the mess tent during Eleanor's lesson, his eyes, small and piggy, raking over her form. Well, what have we here?" Blackwood sneered, his voice dripping with insinuation. "The camp schoolmarm, and knocked up too. Quite the enterprise you're running." Some of the newer, rougher miners snickered. Eleanor's face paled, but she stood her ground, her chin high. "These men are learning to read, sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "Learning to waste company time. More like," Blackwood retorted, stepping closer. "Perhaps you should be teaching them other skills." Before anyone could react, Caleb Thornton stepped out of the shadows at the tent's entrance. He hadn't planned to intervene so directly, but Blackwood's blatant disrespect, the way Eleanor flinched, ignited a cold fury in him. "Mr. Blackwood," Caleb's voice was quiet, but it cut through the tense atmosphere like a whip. "I believe Mrs. Hayes and her students are under the patronage of the Maine Consolidated Mining Office, which, as you know, I have significant interests in." This was a fabrication, a swift and audacious lie, but delivered with such authority that Blackwood visibly faltered. Caleb's reputation as a wealthy and influential man was well known, even in this remote outpost. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "I wasn't aware." "There are many things you are not aware of," Caleb said, his gaze like chips of ice. "Perhaps you should confine your expertise to managing the mine, and leave the educational welfare of its workers to those better suited." He took a deliberate step further into the tent, positioning himself slightly in front of Eleanor. The miners, who had tensed at Blackwood's intrusion, visibly relaxed, a collective sigh almost audible. Big Tim even allowed himself a small, fierce grin. Blackwood, clearly outmaneuvered and unwilling to challenge a man of Caleb's standing, scowled. "No offense meant, Mr. Thornton," Just making observations, he backed away, muttering under his breath, and then strode out of the tent. Silence descended, thick and charged. Eleanor stared at Caleb, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock, confusion, and dawning gratitude. He had defended her publicly, powerfully. But his claim of patronage, what did it mean? Caleb turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "Are you all right, Mrs. Hayes?" "Yes," she whispered. "Thank you, Mr. Thornton. But I don't understand." He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Perhaps it is time we spoke. Privately." His intervention had been decisive, but it had also ripped away his cloak of anonymity. His plan, whatever its ultimate form, was now in the open, at least in its protective aspect. He had drawn a line in the sand, and in doing so, had bound himself more closely to Eleanor Hayes and her uncertain future. The stakes had just been raised, for both of them. He felt a tremor of apprehension, but also a sense of rightness. He had acted finally and irrevocably. Now he had to see it through. The miners watched, a silent, assessing audience, as Caleb Thornton gently guided Eleanor Hayes from the mess tent. Whispers followed them, a mixture of awe at Thornton's bold move and rampant speculation about his motives. Eleanor herself felt as though she were moving through a dream, her legs unsteady, her mind racing to process the swift, dramatic turn of events. Mr. Thornton, the wealthy, aloof figure she'd occasionally seen observing the camp, had not only intervened on her behalf but had claimed a connection to her work that simply didn't exist. They walked in silence towards the small, relatively well-maintained cabin he rented at the more secluded western edge of Blackwood Creek. It was a modest structure, but compared to her shed, it seemed a palace. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, inviting glow over the simple furnishings. A sturdy table, 2 chairs, a neatly made bunk. It was a space of order and quiet comfort, a stark contrast to the chaotic energy of the camp. Caleb gestured towards one of the chairs. "Please, Mrs. Hayes, seat." She did, perching on the edge, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He remained standing for a moment, looking into the fire, as if gathering his thoughts. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the flames and the distant clang of a hammer on steel from the mine. "Mrs. Hayes," he began, turning to face her, his expression serious, his voice calm and measured. "I owe you an apology for the liberties I took in there, claiming a patronage that wasn't formally established." Eleanor found her voice, though it was little more than a whisper. "Why did you do it, Mr. Thornton?" He met her gaze directly. "Because Mr. Blackwood is a bully, and what he was implying was offensive and untrue. And because—" he paused, choosing his words carefully. "I have been concerned for your welfare." "Concerned?" she repeated, a note of disbelief in her tone. "You don't even know me." "Perhaps not as well as I would like," he admitted, a faint hint of something unreadable in his eyes. "But I have been in Blackwood Creek for some weeks, Mrs. Hayes. I've seen your dedication to teaching the miners. I've seen your courage in the face of considerable hardship. These are qualities I admire." Her heart fluttered, a confusing mix of apprehension and a strange, unfamiliar warmth. "The gifts, the food, the blanket, was that you?" He nodded slowly. "I hope to offer some small comfort without alarming you." "Alarming me?" A small, wry smile touched her lips. "Mr. Thornton, my life for the past few months has been a study in alarm." A little anonymous kindness was more baffling than frightening. He allowed himself a slight smile in return. "My apologies, then, for my lack of finesse. It is not a quality I am often accused of possessing." He moved to the small stove, pouring her a cup of coffee from a pot that simmered there, its rich aroma filling the cabin. He handed it to her, his fingers brushing hers briefly, sending an unexpected tingle up her arm. "Mr. Thornton," she said, cradling the warm mug, "I am grateful for your help truly, but I still don't understand your interest. You are a man of means. Blackwood Creek and a struggling teacher hardly seem like your usual concerns." He pulled the other chair closer, sitting opposite her. "My usual concerns," he said, his gaze steady, "are often about potential, about building something of value. I see potential in those minors you teach. And I see immense value in you, Mrs. Hayes." Eleanor felt a blush creep up her neck. Such directness was disarming. "I have a proposition for you," he continued, his tone becoming more businesslike, yet still retaining a certain gentleness. "It is why I initially sought to understand your situation before approaching you." She waited, her breath held. This was it. The reason behind the observations, the gifts, the defense. "I own a ranch several days' ride from here," he said. "It's a prosperous place, a good place. I am also involved in the development of a new township nearby, a place called Redemption. It aims to be a town built on solid foundations, with a school, a church, a future." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Redemption needs a teacher, Mrs. Hayes. A proper schoolhouse is already planned. The children of the settlers, and indeed any adults who wish to learn, will need instruction. I believe you are uniquely qualified for such a post." Eleanor stared at him, speechless. A real school? A town called Redemption? It sounded like something from a dream. The position would come with a comfortable cottage, a fair salary, and the respect of the community, Caleb continued. "And, of course, a safe and healthy environment for you and your child." Her hand went instinctively to her belly. Safety, stability, these were the things she craved more than anything. "Why me?" she finally managed to ask. "There must be other teachers, more formally trained perhaps." "Perhaps," he conceded. "But I have seen your dedication, your patience. You don't just teach letters, Mrs. Hayes. You instill hope. That is a rare gift. And frankly," a shadow crossed his face, "I've also seen your current circumstances. This is no place for you, especially not now." Her mind reeled. The offer was overwhelming, a lifeline thrown to her when she was close to drowning. But a part of her, the part that had learned to be wary, to expect the hidden barb in every kindness, was hesitant. "This is extraordinarily generous, Mr. Thornton. What would you expect in return?" His expression softened. "Your commitment to the school, to your students. Your willingness to help build something good in Redemption. Nothing more, nothing less." He leaned forward slightly. "I understand this is sudden. I don't expect an answer immediately. But I wanted you to know that there is an alternative to this." He gestured vaguely, encompassing the hardship of Blackwood Creek. Eleanor looked down at her hands, at the worn fabric of her dress. The future he described was so far removed from her current reality, it was difficult to grasp. A cottage, a salary, respect. For so long, she had lived day to day, focused only on survival. To think beyond that, to plan, to hope, it was a fragile, unfamiliar feeling. I need to think," she said. "Of course," Caleb replied, his voice gentle. "Take all the time you need. But know that the offer is sincere, and it stands." He rose. "For now, please finish your coffee. Rest a while. No one will bother you here." He moved towards the door. "I have some business to attend to in the camp. I will return in an hour or so. We can talk more then if you wish. Or you can simply return to your lodgings when you feel ready." He left, closing the door softly behind him, leaving Eleanor alone with the crackling fire and the momentous proposal hanging in the air. She replayed his words, his tone, the look in his eyes. There had been no hint of coercion, no untoward suggestion. Only a quiet strength, a surprising empathy, and an offer that could change her life, and the life of her unborn child, irrevocably. She thought of the cold shed, the leering eyes of men like Blackwood, the constant gnawing fear. And then she thought of redemption, of a schoolhouse, of a future. A tiny, cautious seed of hope began to take root in the barren ground of her heart. But trust was a difficult crop to cultivate after a lifetime of disappointment. Caleb Thornton had offered her a future. The question was, could she dare to believe in it? And in him? The warmth of the cabin, the taste of real coffee, the quiet dignity of the man who had just offered her an escape. It all felt surreal. She touched her belly again. For this child, she had to consider it, truly consider it. Over the next few days, a subtle shift occurred in Blackwood Creek. Caleb Thornton's public defense of Eleanor had sent a clear message. The overt harassment ceased. Even Silas Blackwood kept his distance, his sneers replaced by sullen glares from afar. The miners, already protective, now treated Eleanor with an added measure of respect, as if Caleb's interest had somehow validated her worth in their eyes. They still came for their lessons, their determination fueled by a new sense of pride, as if their learning was now part of something larger, something endorsed. Eleanor, however, was in turmoil. Caleb's offer echoed in her mind, a constant counterpoint to the harsh realities of her daily existence. She found herself observing him more closely during his infrequent, but now less surreptitious visits to the camp. He moved with a quiet confidence, his interactions with the miners and merchants direct and fair. There was an integrity about him that she found herself increasingly drawn to, yet still wary of. Her past with Silas, the child's father, had taught her that charming words and grand gestures could mask deceit and abandonment. Caleb, for his part, gave her space. He did not press for an answer. He would nod politely when their paths crossed, his eyes holding a quiet inquiry, but he made no further mention of his proposal. He understood her hesitation. Trust, once broken, was a difficult thing to mend. He continued his subtle support, ensuring that better quality firewood found its way to her shed, that a portion of fresh game from a successful hunt was shared with her via Jed, who had become a willing, if unwitting, intermediary. One evening, as Eleanor was packing away her slates after the lesson, young Davy approached her, his face alight with excitement. He held a tattered piece of newspaper in his hand. "Ms. Hayes, look, I can read this bit here." He pointed a grimy finger at a headline. It says, "New town prospers in Redemption Valley." He stumbled over the longer words, but the triumph in his voice was unmistakable. "Is that the place Mr. Thornton talked about? Redemption?" Eleanor's heart gave a lurch. "Yes, Davy. I believe it is. Sounds like a good place," Davy said wistfully. Maybe folks like us could go there someday. Folks who can read now, thanks to you." His innocent words struck her deeply. She was not just teaching them letters. She was opening doors to possibilities, to dreams of a better life. And Caleb Thornton was offering her a chance to do that on a grander scale, in a place whose very name spoke of new beginnings. That night she couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside her shed, rattling the loose boards. She felt the baby kick, a strong, insistent movement. This child deserved more than a life eked out in the shadows of a rough mining camp. It deserved a home, security, a future. Caleb's offer wasn't just about her. It was about her child. The next morning, she sought him out. She found him by the assayer's office, discussing a sample of ore with the grizzled assayer. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Thornton," she began, her voice a little breathless. "May I have a word with you?" He excused himself from the assayer and turned to her, his full attention on her. "Mrs. Hayes." "Of course." She took a deep breath. I have thought about your offer. About redemption." He waited patiently, his gaze steady. "If the offer still stands," she said, her voice gaining strength, "I would like to accept." A slow smile spread across Caleb's face, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners and transforming his usually stern features into something remarkably warm. "It stands, Mrs. Hayes, and I am very glad." Relief washed over Eleanor, so potent it almost buckled her knees. She had made a decision, taken a leap of faith. "There are, of course, details to discuss," Caleb said, his tone becoming practical once more, though the warmth remained in his eyes. "Arrangements for your journey. The specifics of the schoolhouse, your accommodation. We should talk soon." "Yes," she agreed. "Soon." As she walked away, a sense of lightness filled her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. The future was still uncertain, still daunting, but for the first time, it held a flicker of genuine hope, a beacon lit by the unexpected kindness of a wealthy cowboy with a plan. She didn't know then that his plan was already evolving, shifting from a mere offer of employment to something far more intricate, something that might involve not just her future, but his own in ways neither of them could yet fully comprehend. He watched her walk back towards the heart of the camp, her step a little lighter, her shoulders a little straighter. A profound sense of satisfaction settled over him. Phase 1 of his plan was complete. The next phases, however, would require even more careful navigation, for they ventured into the uncharted territory of shared lives and intertwined destinies. The news of Eleanor's impending departure, and her destination, spread through Blackwood Creek like wildfire. The initial reaction among the miners was a mixture of dismay at losing their teacher and a genuine happiness for her improved prospects. Big Tim, his voice thick with emotion, had clasped her hand in his massive ones. "We'll miss you something fierce, Miss Hayes. But redemption. It sounds like a place a good woman like you deserves." Young Davy, his eyes shining, promised to keep practicing his reading, to make her proud. Even Jed, a man of few words, gave a gruff nod of approval. "Thornton's a square dealer," he'd said. "You'll be all right with him." Caleb, true to his word, began making arrangements. He informed her that he would be concluding his business in Blackwood Creek within the week and would then personally escort her to Redemption. The journey, he explained, would take several days by wagon, and he would ensure her comfort and safety. He spoke of the cottage that was being prepared for her, small, but sturdy, with a garden plot and a view of the rolling hills. He described the schoolhouse, a new log structure with proper desks and a blackboard, a far cry from the drafty corner of the mess tent. As they discussed these practicalities, Eleanor found herself observing Caleb with a new lens. His efficiency was undeniable, his attention to detail meticulous. But beyond the capable businessman, she began to see glimpses of the man beneath. The way his eyes softened when he spoke of redemption, not just as an investment, but as a community he was helping to build. The quiet respect he showed her, always addressing her as Mrs. Hayes, always ensuring she was comfortable during their discussions. There was a loneliness about him too, she thought, a certain reserve that hinted at a life lived largely in solitude despite his wealth and standing. Her own feelings were a confusing tapestry of gratitude, cautious optimism, and a lingering thread of apprehension. She was entrusting her future, and that of her child, to this man she barely knew. Yet, every action he took, every word he spoke, seemed to reinforce the sincerity of his intentions. He asked nothing of her but her skills as a teacher, her willingness to contribute to his vision for redemption. The day before their planned departure, a shadow from Eleanor's past fell over Blackwood Creek. A dusty, travel-worn man rode into camp, his eyes scanning the faces with a predatory stillness. He was lean and wiry, with a cruel twist to his mouth and a swagger that spoke of false confidence. Eleanor saw him from the doorway of the general store, and her blood ran cold. It was Silas. Silas, the father of her child, the man who had abandoned her, the man she had fled. Panic seized her. She ducked back into the shadows of the store, her heart hammering against her ribs. What was he doing here? How had he found her? Had he come for her? Or worse, for the child, seeing it as some kind of leverage? She had to warn Caleb. But how, without revealing the full, shameful story of her past? Caleb, meanwhile, was down by the creek, checking the horses he'd purchased for their journey. He was meticulously going over the tack when Jed approached him, his face grim. "Mr. Thornton, sir. There's a newcomer in camp. Askin questions. About Ms. Hayes." Caleb straightened, his eyes instantly alert. "What kind of questions?" "Askin if a woman, in her condition passed through here. Described her pretty well. Calls himself Silas. Says he's lookin' for his wife." Caleb's jaw tightened. Wife. Eleanor had never mentioned a husband. He had assumed, perhaps wrongly, that her child was the result of a more tragic, less formal liaison. The word wife implied a legal claim, a complication he hadn't anticipated. "Where is he now?" Caleb asked, his voice calm, belying the sudden tension coiling within him. "Last I saw, headin' for the saloon." "Seems the type," Jed said with distaste. Caleb nodded. "Thank you, Jed. Keep an eye on things. And try to ensure Mrs. Hayes doesn't encounter him if possible. I'll handle this." He walked towards the saloon, his mind racing. This changed things. If this Silas had a legitimate claim on Eleanor, his own plans for her future in redemption could be jeopardized. More importantly, Eleanor herself could be in danger. He had seen men like Silas before, charming on the surface, rotten to the core, capable of cruelty and manipulation. He found Silas at the bar, already nursing a whiskey, boasting loudly to anyone who would listen about his long search for his beloved wife. Caleb approached him, his presence radiating a quiet authority that momentarily silenced the man's bluster. "You're looking for a Mrs. Hayes?" Caleb asked, his tone neutral. Silas looked him up and down, a sneer forming on his lips. "That's right. Eleanor Hayes. My wife. Heard she might be around here. You know her?" "I do," Caleb said. "She's under my protection." Silas laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Your protection? That's rich. She's my wife, and she's carrying my child. I've come to take her home." "Is that what she wants?" Caleb asked, his eyes unwavering. "What she wants don't much matter," Silas said, his voice turning ugly. "She's mine. By law." Caleb felt a surge of cold anger. This man spoke of Eleanor as if she were a piece of property. "Mrs. Hayes is a free woman, capable of making her own decisions," Caleb stated, his voice hardening. "And she has made arrangements to leave Blackwood Creek tomorrow for a new life, a new position." Silas slammed his glass on the bar. "Not without me, she ain't. I got rights. That's my kid she's carryin'. I ain't about to let some high and mighty stranger waltz off with what's mine." His eyes narrowed. Unless you got a special interest in her yourself, mister?" He smirked. "Maybe you're the reason she ran off in the first place, eh?" The insinuation was vile, but Caleb kept his composure. "My interest is in ensuring Mrs. Hayes's well-being and safety, something that seems to have been lacking in her life thus far." "You don't know nothing about it?" Silas snarled, pushing himself away from the bar, trying to use his height to intimidate. Caleb didn't flinch. "I know she's a good woman who deserves respect and a secure future," Caleb said firmly. "And I intend to see that she gets it." "She's coming with me," Silas insisted, his hand dropping to the worn pistol at his hip. "One way or another." The saloon had grown quiet, the other patrons watching the confrontation with avid interest. Caleb knew he had to de-escalate this, but also make his position clear. Violence was the last thing Eleanor needed. "Perhaps," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a lower, more compelling register. "There's a way to resolve this without unpleasantness. If your concern is truly for the child, as you claim he was buying time, thinking, assessing the man before him." Silas was driven by greed and possessiveness, not love or concern. That much was clear. His plan for Eleanor had just encountered its first major, and very dangerous obstacle. He needed to protect her, not just from Silas's immediate threat, but from any legal claim he might try to enforce. The solution that began to form in Caleb's mind was audacious, risky, and would change the nature of his relationship with Eleanor forever. It was a gamble, but for her safety, for the future he'd envisioned for her and her child in redemption, it was a gamble he was increasingly willing to take. He just hoped Eleanor would understand and agree. Eleanor, meanwhile, had managed to slip out of the general store and, keeping to the shadows, made her way to Caleb's cabin. She found it empty. Panic clawed at her. Where was he? Had Silas found him first? She paced the small room, her mind a torment of fear and recrimination. She should have told Caleb about Silas, about her past. Her silence had now put him, and her own fragile hopes, in jeopardy. Just as her anxiety reached a fever pitch, the door opened, and Caleb stepped in. His face was grim, but he gave her a reassuring look. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm glad you're here. We need to talk." "Silas," she whispered, her voice choked. "He's here. I saw him." "I know," Caleb said quietly. "I've spoken with him." Her eyes widened in alarm. Did he? "He's made his claims," Caleb said, his expression hardening. "He says you're his wife, that the child is his. He intends to take you with him." Eleanor sank onto a chair, her face ashen. "It's true," she confessed, the words tumbling out in a torrent of shame and fear. "We were married. A justice of the peace. A hasty ceremony. I was foolish, I believed his promises. He was not a kind man. When I told him about the baby, he became worse. He saw it as a burden, then as a means to control me. I had to leave. I thought I'd lost him." Tears streamed down her face. "Oh, Caleb, I'm so sorry. I should have told you." Caleb moved to her side, kneeling beside her chair, his usual reserve replaced by a deep, compassionate concern. He gently took her trembling hands in his. "Eleanor," he said, using her first name for the first time, his voice soft but firm, "there is nothing to apologize for. You did what you had to do to protect yourself and your child. That took courage." His unexpected kindness, the simple act of holding her hands, undid her. She sobbed, the fear and shame she had carried for so long finally breaking free. Caleb waited patiently, his grip steady and reassuring, until her sobs subsided. "He claims he has rights," she said, her voice hoarse. "Legal rights." "He does," Caleb acknowledged, his face serious. "As your husband, the law would likely side with him, especially concerning the child. Unless," he paused, his gaze intense, searching hers, "unless you were no longer his wife. Or rather, unless you were another man's wife." Eleanor stared at him, confusion warring with a dawning, incredulous understanding. What are you saying?" "Silas is motivated by greed and control, not by affection," Caleb said, his voice low and urgent. "He sees you and the child as assets. If you were married to someone else, someone with means, someone who could make it difficult for him to press his claims, he might be persuaded to relinquish them. For a price, perhaps." "Married?" she whispered, her mind reeling. "To whom?" Caleb's gaze did not waver. "To me, Eleanor." The words hung in the air, audacious, stunning. Eleanor felt as if the breath had been knocked from her. Marry Caleb Thornton? A man she respected, a man who had shown her extraordinary kindness, but a man who was still largely a stranger. "But why would you do that?" she stammered. "You've already offered me so much. A position, a home." "The position and the home are still yours, regardless," he said firmly. "But marriage would offer you and your child the ultimate protection. It would sever Silas's legal ties to you. It would give your child my name, my legitimacy. No one would question your place in redemption or your child's. She looked at him, truly looked at him, seeing not just the wealthy benefactor, but a man of deep integrity, willing to take an extraordinary step to protect her. But the implications were enormous. This would be a marriage in name only? She asked, needing to understand. A business arrangement. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. It would be whatever we agree for it to be, Eleanor. Primarily, it would be a shield, a way to secure your freedom and your child's future. What it might become, that would be up to us. In time, he squeezed her hands gently. I know this is a shock, this is a drastic solution, but Silas is not a man who will simply walk away. He sees an opportunity. We must present him with an obstacle he cannot overcome, or a price he cannot refuse for his silence and departure. Eleanor's mind raced. A marriage of convenience. To a man like Caleb Thornton, it was a staggering proposition. But the alternative, returning to a life with Silas, a life of fear and subjugation, was unthinkable. She thought of her child, the innocent life within her. This child deserved a father, a name, a secure future. Caleb was offering all of that. What about you, Caleb? She asked, her voice soft. What do you gain from this? You would be tying yourself to a woman with a complicated past, a child that is not yours. He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw a vulnerability in his eyes, a hint of the loneliness she had sensed in him. Perhaps, Eleanor, he said quietly, I too am looking for something, a purpose beyond accumulating wealth, a chance to build something meaningful. Redemption is part of that, and perhaps a family, however unconventional its beginnings, is also part of it. His honesty touched her deeply. This was not just charity. It was a proposal that, in its own way, offered him something too. Partnership, a shared future. She took a deep breath, the decision forming in her heart with a surprising clarity. Fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a burgeoning sense of hope and a profound gratitude for this man's extraordinary offer. If you are truly willing to do this, Caleb, she said, her voice stronger now, meeting his gaze, then yes, I will marry you. A slow smile of relief spread across Caleb's face. Then we have a plan, he said. A new plan. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. First, we deal with Silas. Then we go to redemption as husband and wife. The words sounded strange, yet also strangely right. Eleanor Hayes, soon to be Eleanor Thornton. Her life, which had been a desperate flight from the past, was now hurtling towards an entirely unexpected and potentially wonderful future. The wealthy cowboy's plan for her had just become their plan. A pact forged in the face of adversity, a promise of protection, and perhaps, just perhaps, a chance at happiness. Caleb moved quickly. He knew Silas was a creature of opportunity and intimidation. He needed to be confronted with a reality that offered him no leverage and a clear, if unpalatable, way out. He left Eleanor in the cabin, assuring her he would handle Silas, and went to find the circuit judge, Elms, who, by a stroke of fortune, had arrived in Blackwood Creek that very afternoon to deal with a backlog of disputes and claims. Judge Elms was a man Caleb knew and respected, a stern but fair adjudicator who valued order and the sanctity of contracts, including marriage contracts. Caleb explained the situation to Judge Elms succinctly, omitting the more delicate details of his burgeoning feelings for Eleanor, but emphasizing Silas's abandonment and Eleanor's vulnerable position. He then laid out his proposal. He and Eleanor wished to marry immediately. A marriage, properly recorded, would supersede Silas's claims, especially given his long absence and Eleanor's clear desire to be free of him. Judge Elms listened, his expression thoughtful. He knew Caleb Thornton's reputation for integrity. He also knew the kind of opportunistic drifters that preyed on vulnerable women on the frontier. A swift marriage, you say, Thornton? Judge Elms mused, stroking his beard. Under these circumstances, with the Estranged husband present and making claims, it would certainly clarify matters legally. He looked at Caleb sharply. You're sure about this, son? This isn't some impulsive chivalry you'll regret. I am sure, Judge, Caleb said firmly. Mrs. Hayes has agreed. We wish to secure her protection and the child's legitimacy without delay. The judge nodded. Very well. Bring the lady and your witnesses. We can perform the ceremony in my temporary chambers at the hotel. As for Mr. Silas, it might be best if he were made an offer he can't refuse, to ensure he doesn't cause further trouble. Caleb then sought out Silas, finding him still lingering near the saloon. Trying to stir up support for his rights, Caleb drew him aside, his demeanor all business. Silas, Caleb said, his voice devoid of emotion, I have spoken with Judge Elms. Mrs. Hayes, soon to be Mrs. Thornton, and I are to be married this afternoon. Your claim on her will become legally void. Silas's face contorted with rage. You can't do that. She's my wife. She was your wife, Caleb corrected calmly. A wife you abandoned. The law tends to favor present commitment over past neglect, especially when a child's welfare is at stake. However, Caleb paused, letting his words sink in. I am a reasonable man. I understand you've incurred expenses traveling here, expecting a different outcome. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small, heavy pouch. This is $500.
A considerable sum.
Enough for you to start fresh, somewhere far from here. In return, you will sign a document, witnessed by the judge, relinquishing any and all claims on Eleanor and her child, and you will leave Blackwood Creek by sundown. If you refuse or cause any further disturbance, I will ensure Judge Elms is made fully aware of your character and your past treatment of Eleanor. I doubt he would look kindly upon it. Silas stared at the pouch, then at Caleb's resolute face. Greed warred with his bluster. $500 was more money than he'd seen in years. The fight was going out of him, replaced by a sullen calculation. He knew when he was beaten, especially when faced with a man of Caleb's evident wealth and determination, now backed by the law. Make it 600, Silas blustered, a final attempt at leverage. Caleb met his gaze coolly. 500, and your signature. Or nothing, and you face the consequences. Silas hesitated for a long moment, then snatched the pouch. All right, he grumbled. Draw up your damned paper. But I want that cash counted. The ceremony was brief, conducted in Judge Elms's cramped hotel room. Jed and Big Tim, their faces scrubbed clean and their expressions a mixture of awe and solemn pride, stood as witnesses. Eleanor, wearing a simple but clean dress that Caleb had discreetly arranged for her to acquire from the general store, stood beside him, her hand trembling slightly in his. Her earlier tears had been replaced by a quiet composure, though her eyes held a mixture of gratitude, uncertainty, and a nascent hope. When Judge Elms pronounced them man and wife, Caleb turned to Eleanor. He had not planned this, but the moment felt right. He gently lifted her hand and pressed a soft, respectful kiss to her knuckles. Mrs. Thornton, he said, his voice low, for her ears only, a hint of a smile in his eyes. A faint blush rose on her cheeks, but she met his gaze, a shy smile touching her own lips. Mr. Thornton. Silas, looking resentful but cowed, signed the relinquishment document under the judge's steely gaze, pocketed his money, and was last seen riding out of Blackwood Creek as the sun dipped below the horizon, a disgruntled and defeated figure fading into the dust. The immediate threat was neutralized. Eleanor felt a wave of relief so profound it left her weak. She was free of Silas, truly free, and she was married to Caleb Thornton. The reality of it was still sinking in. That evening, Caleb did not press her. He had arranged for her to have his cabin for the night, while he took a room at the small, rough hotel. You need rest, Eleanor, he said gently. We leave for redemption at first light. There will be time enough to talk, to adjust. His consideration touched her deeply. He was a man of immense power and wealth, yet he treated her with a respect and tenderness she had never known. As she lay in the surprisingly comfortable bunk in Caleb's cabin, the scent of his bay rum and leather lingering faintly in the air, she felt a sense of peace, a fragile security she hadn't dared to hope for. Her hand rested on her belly. Her child would have a name, a father, a future, and she was Mrs. Thornton. A new life, a new identity, a new beginning in a town called Redemption. The path ahead was still unknown, but for the first time in a very long time, Eleanor Hayes Thornton faced it not with fear, but with a cautious, burgeoning hope. Caleb's plan for her had taken an unexpected, dramatic turn, but in doing so, it had also forged a bond between them, a commitment made before law and witnesses, a foundation upon which, perhaps, something real and lasting could be built. The journey to Redemption took 4 days. Caleb had procured a sturdy, well-sprung wagon, ensuring Eleanor's comfort as much as possible. He drove the team himself, his hands skilled and confident on the reins. They traveled through a landscape that gradually softened from the harsh, rocky terrain around Blackwood Creek to rolling grasslands dotted with oak and, eventually, the fertile expanse of Redemption Valley. The days settled into a quiet rhythm. They spoke little at first, the newness of their situation creating a certain formality between them. But as the miles passed, a cautious ease began to develop. Caleb would point out landmarks, talk about the plans for Redemption, the types of crops that thrived in the valley, the families who had already settled there. He spoke with a quiet passion, his vision for the new town clear and inspiring. Eleanor found herself listening intently, asking questions, her initial reserve slowly melting away. She, in turn, began to share more about herself, not the painful details of her time with Silas, but her love of books, her dreams of teaching, the small joys and sorrows of her earlier life before her world had narrowed to mere survival. Caleb was a good listener, his thoughtful silences as eloquent as his words. He never pried, but his gentle encouragement made it easy for her to open up. She learned that he was an avid reader himself, his cabin back at his main ranch boasting a library that was his greatest pride. They discovered a shared appreciation for certain poets, a surprising common ground that forged another small link between them. Evenings were spent by a crackling campfire. Caleb would see to the horses, prepare their simple meals with an efficiency that spoke of long practice, and ensure Eleanor was comfortable and warm. He treated her with an unfailing courtesy that was both reassuring and, at times, a little bewildering. He was her husband, yet he maintained a respectful distance, sleeping on a bedroll under the stars while she took the sheltered space within the wagon. This wasn't the behavior of a man who had married for convenience alone, she thought. There was a deeper consideration, a protective tenderness in his actions that went beyond any practical arrangement. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the vast, star-strewn sky arching above them, Eleanor found the courage to ask a question that had been weighing on her mind. "Caleb," she began hesitantly, "this marriage, you did it to protect me, to give my child a name. I am more grateful than I can say. But what do you truly want from this? For yourself?" He looked into the flames for a long moment before answering, his profile strong and thoughtful in the flickering light. "When I first saw you in Blackwood Creek, Eleanor," he said slowly, "I saw a woman of courage and intelligence, struggling against unfair odds. My initial plan, as I told you, was to offer you a position, a way out. But when Silas appeared, things changed. My reasons for proposing marriage were, as I said, primarily for your protection." He paused, then turned to look at her, his gaze direct and sincere. "But it would be dishonest to say that is my only reason now. These past few days, talking with you, getting to know you, I find myself thinking that perhaps this arrangement, born of necessity, could become something more." Her heart gave a little leap. "More?" she whispered. "A true partnership, perhaps," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. Companionship, maybe even affection in time. I am not a man for grand pronouncements, Eleanor, but I believe we share certain values, a certain outlook on life. I am willing to see where this path might lead us, if you are. His words, spoken with such quiet honesty, resonated deeply within her. She had married him out of desperation, for security. But she was beginning to see the man behind the protector, the quiet strength, the hidden kindness, the unexpected depths. And she found herself drawn to him. I am willing, Caleb, she said softly, meeting his gaze. I am willing to see. A comfortable silence settled between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. The fire crackled, the crickets sang their nightly chorus, and under the vast expanse of the western sky, two people, brought together by circumstance, began to glimpse the potential for a future that was more than just convenient, a future that might, with time and care, blossom into something truly meaningful. As they crested the final rise, Redemption Valley spread out before them, a patchwork of green and gold under the afternoon sun. A river snaked its way through the valley floor, its banks lined with cottonwoods. Smoke curled from the chimneys of scattered homesteads, and in the distance, the nascent town of Redemption was taking shape, a cluster of newly built log structures, including a prominent building that Caleb pointed out as the schoolhouse. Welcome to Redemption, Eleanor, Caleb said, his voice holding a note of quiet pride. Eleanor gazed at the scene, a lump forming in her throat. It was beautiful, peaceful, a world away from the grit and desperation of Blackwood Creek. Felt like hope. Their arrival in Redemption caused a stir of polite curiosity. Caleb Thornton was a respected figure, the town's primary benefactor, and his arrival with a wife, a development no one had anticipated, was news indeed. Caleb handled the introductions with a quiet dignity, presenting Eleanor simply as my wife, Eleanor Thornton, who will be our new schoolteacher. The cottage prepared for them, was charming. It was newly built, smelling of fresh pine, with 2 small bedrooms, a cozy main room with a stone fireplace, and a kitchen overlooking a garden already tilled and ready for planting. Simple, sturdy furniture had been installed. It was more than she could have ever dreamed of. It's wonderful, Caleb, she said, her voice thick with emotion as she stood in the doorway, taking it all in. It's home, Eleanor, he replied gently. Our home. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Eleanor threw herself into preparing the schoolhouse, Caleb often working alongside her, sanding desks, building shelves, his quiet presence a constant support. The townsfolk, initially a little reserved, soon warmed to Eleanor's gentle manner and obvious dedication. Mothers brought her offerings of fresh bread and preserves, eager to enroll their children. Men tipped their hats respectfully. She began to feel a sense of belonging, of community, that she hadn't experienced since her own childhood. Her relationship with Caleb continued to evolve in its quiet, undramatic way. They settled into a domestic routine. He was an early riser, often out checking on the progress of the town or his nearby agricultural ventures before she awoke. They shared meals, their conversations ranging from the practicalities of setting up the school to discussions about the books they were reading. He remained unfailingly considerate, always ensuring her comfort as her pregnancy advanced. The second bedroom remained his, a silent testament to his patience, his willingness to let their relationship develop at its own pace. But Eleanor found herself increasingly drawn to his quiet strength, his unwavering integrity, his unexpected moments of dry humor. She saw the respect he commanded from the townsfolk, not through dominance, but through fairness and a genuine commitment to their collective well-being. She saw the kindness in his eyes when he spoke to the children who shyly approached him. This was a good man, a truly good man, and he was her husband. The thought no longer felt strange, it felt right. One evening, as they sat before the fire in their cottage, a comfortable silence between them, Eleanor reached out and hesitantly placed her hand on his. He looked at her, his eyebrows raised in a silent question. "Caleb," she said softly, I want you to know, this place, this life, it's more than I ever dared to hope for. And you've given me more than just protection and a name. You've given me back my hope, my dignity." He turned his hand, his fingers lacing through hers, his touch warm and firm. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You had those things within you all along. I merely provided a safer harbor for them to flourish." He looked at their joined hands, then into her eyes, and she saw a depth of emotion there that made her heart ache with a sweet, unfamiliar tenderness. "And you," he continued, "have brought a light into my life that I hadn't realized was missing." The air in the small cottage seemed to crackle with unspoken feelings. The chasm of their unconventional beginning was slowly being bridged by shared experiences, mutual respect, and a burgeoning affection that felt as real and solid as the stone fireplace before them. He leaned closer, his gaze searching hers. "Eleanor," he began, then seemed to hesitate, as if unsure how to voice the emotions that were clearly stirring within him. She didn't need him to say the words. She saw it in his eyes, felt it in the warmth of his hand, in the gentle strength of his presence. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that her own feelings for him had grown beyond gratitude, beyond respect. Just as he was about to speak further, a sharp pain shot through Eleanor, making her gasp and clutch her belly. Caleb was instantly alert, his concern overriding whatever he had been about to say. "Eleanor? What is it?" "The baby?" she breathed, another contraction gripping her. I think it's time." The climax of Caleb's plan for Eleanor's future had arrived, not in a confrontation with a villain, but in the most natural, most profound event of human existence. The birth of her child, their child in all but blood, would be the true sealing of their bond, the true beginning of their life together in redemption. Caleb moved with swift efficiency, his earlier plans for this eventuality clicking into place. He helped Eleanor to the bed, his touch gentle but firm, his voice calm and reassuring despite the anxiety that gnawed at him. He sent one of the older boys from a neighboring homestead running for Mrs. Peterson, the town midwife, a sturdy, capable woman whose calm demeanor was a balm in any crisis. The hours that followed were a testament to Eleanor's strength and Caleb's unwavering support. He stayed by her side, holding her hand, wiping her brow, murmuring words of encouragement. He had never witnessed a birth before, and the raw, elemental power of it filled him with a profound awe and a fierce protectiveness towards this woman who was showing such incredible courage. He saw not the vulnerable teacher he had sought to rescue, but a warrior, fighting a valiant battle. His admiration for her deepened into something akin to reverence. As dawn painted the eastern sky with hues of rose and gold, Eleanor gave one final, exhausted cry, and then the sound of a newborn's wail filled the small cottage. Mrs. Peterson, beaming, announced, "It's a fine, healthy boy, Mrs. Thornton. A beautiful boy." Tears streamed down Eleanor's face, tears of relief, of joy, of overwhelming love as Mrs. Peterson placed the swaddled infant in her arms. He was perfect, tiny and precious. She looked up at Caleb, who stood beside the bed, his face etched with emotion, his eyes glistening. "A son, Caleb," she whispered, her voice choked. "We have a son." He reached out a hesitant finger, gently touching the baby's soft cheek. A look of profound wonder, of tenderness so deep it made Eleanor's heart ache, transformed his strong features. "He's remarkable," Caleb breathed, his voice thick. In that moment, standing together beside the bed, gazing at the new life they had welcomed into the world, the last vestiges of their unconventional beginning seemed to melt away. They were not just a man and a woman bound by a marriage of convenience. They were a family, forged in shared adversity, built on mutual respect, and now irrevocably linked by the miracle of this child. Mrs. Peterson, sensing the profound intimacy of the moment, quietly busied herself, then slipped out, leaving them alone with their son. Caleb pulled a chair close to the bed, his gaze never leaving the tiny infant. "Have you thought of a name?" he asked softly. Eleanor looked at her husband, at the strong, kind man who had not only saved her but had given her a future, a home, and now shared in the joy of her child as if he were his own. "I was thinking, perhaps Samuel," she said. "It means God has heard, and I thought, perhaps his middle name could be Caleb." Caleb looked at her, his eyes shining with an emotion too deep for words. He reached for her hand, the one not cradling their son, and brought it to his lips. "Samuel Caleb Thornton," he said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. "It's a fine, strong name, a perfect name." He stayed with her, watching her and the baby, a sense of profound contentment settling over him. His plan for Eleanor's future had been to provide her with safety and security. He had never imagined that in doing so, he would find such a deep and abiding happiness for himself. He had sought to build a town, a community, but in Eleanor and young Samuel, he had found the true heart of his own redemption. Later that day, as Eleanor rested, holding her sleeping son, Caleb stood at the window of their cottage, looking out at the town of redemption. The sun shone brightly, the sounds of life, a hammer ringing, children laughing, a wagon rumbling by, drifted on the breeze. It was a good place, a place of hope and new beginnings. His gaze drifted to the new schoolhouse, sturdy and promising. His teacher, his wife, had brought more than just literacy to redemption. She had brought a spirit of resilience and grace that was already beginning to weave itself into the fabric of the community. He turned back to look at Eleanor and Samuel, a soft smile on his face. He had come to Blackwood Creek seeking a business opportunity, but he had found something infinitely more valuable. He had found a family. He had planned for her future, offering her a lifeline, a way out of a desperate situation. But as he looked at the woman who was his wife, and the child who would bear his name, he knew with absolute certainty that in securing her future, he had irrevocably and wonderfully secured his own. The quiet strength he had admired in her from afar now filled his home and his heart. The journey had been unexpected, the path forged through moments of fear and uncertainty, but it had led them here, to this peaceful cottage, to this new life, together. And Caleb Thornton, the wealthy cowboy with a plan, knew that this was just the beginning. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.